He called it impossible. The janitor's notebook sat open on Dr. Thomas Mitchell's desk like an unwelcome guest, its pages filled with equations that shouldn't have made sense, but somehow did. But it wasn't the complexity of the formulas that haunted the professor that night. It was the way his hands trembled when he realized what they might mean. Before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. He had spent 30 years believing that certain problems in astrophysics could never be solved. And now, in the silent darkness of his office, Dr. Mitchell stared at the work of a man who emptied his trash bins, unsure what terrified him more. The idea that Eddie Santos might be wrong, or that he might be right. Dr. Thomas Mitchell had built his reputation like a fortress, brick by meticulous brick. Every paper he published, every theory he advanced, every graduate student he shepherded to success, all of it constructed with the same exacting precision that defined his life's work in theoretical astrophysics. His office walls at Westbridge University were lined with evidence of his dominance, awards gleaming behind glass, honorary degrees from 3 continents, photographs with Nobel laureates who called him peer rather than protégé. At 52, he was exactly where he had always planned to be, at the summit looking down, control, calculation, certainty. These were the pillars of Thomas Mitchell's existence. For 3 decades, he had cultivated an air of infallibility that few dared to challenge. When he spoke at conferences, auditoriums fell silent. When he reviewed papers, careers trembled. When he dismissed a theory, it stayed dismissed. The E. Mitchell method wasn't just the title of his most cited paper. It had become shorthand for his approach to everything, ruthlessly logical, coldly efficient, and utterly unforgiving of error. His graduate students both feared and revered him. His colleagues both envied and resented him. And for the most part, Thomas preferred it that way. Distance preserved clarity, detachment ensured objectivity. This Tuesday morning had begun like all others, meticulously scheduled down to the minute. Thomas arrived at his office in Matheson Hall precisely at 7:30 a.m., nodded curtly to the security guard, and settled behind his desk to review data from the previous night's simulation run. The Henle-Nakamura paradox had occupied his thoughts for months now. The math was proving stubborn, a complexity that refused to yield to even his most elegant solutions. The problem sat at the intersection of dark energy dynamics and quantum field theory, a place few physicists dared to venture. Thomas had built his late career reputation on addressing exactly these types of impenetrable questions. 3 decades of work had culminated in a computational approach that had cracked previously unsolvable problems. But the Henle-Nakamura paradox was different. It mocked his efforts, remaining impervious to his methods. For weeks now, his simulations had crashed at the same point, the equations descending into mathematical chaos, impossible singularities that his computers couldn't process. It was as if the universe itself was rejecting his intrusion into its deepest secrets. Thomas frowned at his screen, the familiar tension creeping up his neck and settling into his shoulders. 6 months of work, and still no breakthrough. The pressure was mounting. His funding from the National Science Foundation hinged on demonstrable progress. The annual review was 3 weeks away, and he had nothing substantial to show. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. Without waiting for a response, Dr. Eleanor Winters pushed open his door, her expression taut with poorly concealed excitement. "Have you seen it?" she asked, brandishing a tablet. Thomas barely glanced up. "Seen what, Eleanor?" "Harrington's team at NASA. They've announced a breakthrough in hypersonic propulsion. It's all over Physics Today." She placed the tablet in front of him, forcing his attention. Thomas scanned the article quickly, his expression unchanging. James Harrington, once his graduate student, now leading his own team at NASA's Glenn Research Center. The article detailed a revolutionary approach to fuel efficiency in hypersonic flight, one that could potentially make interplanetary travel substantially more viable. "Interesting," Thomas said flatly, pushing the tablet back toward Eleanor. "But hardly groundbreaking. They've simply applied Kuramada's theorem to a new context. It's application, not innovation." Eleanor's enthusiasm dimmed visibly. "But it solves the oxidation problem that's plagued the field for decades. They're calling it a paradigm shift. The media always needs its hyperboles." Thomas turned back to his computer. "Was there something specific you needed, Eleanor?" "I'm rather occupied with the Henley-Nakamura simulations." "Any progress?" she asked, knowing the answer. "Not yet, but it's only a matter of time and computational power." Eleanor hesitated, then placed a folder on his desk. "The department budget proposals are due Friday. The dean is particularly interested in your projections for the coming year, especially given the," she paused delicately, "limited results from the current grant cycle." Thomas felt a spark of irritation. "You can assure Dean Wallace that results in theoretical. Physics aren't manufactured to suit administrative timelines. Some problems require years, not quarters." "Of course," Eleanor replied, her voice carefully neutral, "but the funding committee doesn't operate on the same time frame as the cosmos. They need tangible outcomes." After she left, Thomas stared at the budget folder with distaste. The bureaucracy of academia had grown increasingly suffocating over the years. Time that should be devoted to thought was now consumed by endless paperwork, justifications, and the constant pressure to produce results that could be neatly packaged for press releases and donor newsletters. He turned back to his simulations, determined to push through. The afternoon slipped away as he tweaked variables, adjusted parameters, and ran iteration after iteration. Each attempt ended the same way, with the equations collapsing into impossible values. At 6:45 p.m., Thomas finally conceded defeat for the day. The building had grown quiet, most faculty and students long gone. He gathered his notes, locked his computer, and stepped into the hallway, only to nearly collide with a janitorial cart. "Sorry about that, Professor," said a voice, warm and unexpectedly melodic. "Didn't see you coming out." Thomas looked up, momentarily disoriented. The man before him was perhaps in his mid-40s, with salt and pepper hair and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. His blue uniform bore the university's facilities management logo and a name tag that read, Eddie Santos. "No, I'm done," Thomas replied automatically, already stepping around the cart. "Working late again, Dr. Mitchell?" Eddie asked, as if they were acquaintances rather than strangers, occupying vastly different university strata. Thomas paused, faintly surprised. "You know who I am?" Eddie laughed, a genuine sound that seemed out of place in the sterile hallway. "Everyone in Matheson knows Dr. Mitchell. You're kind of a big deal around here." He gestured to the cart. "Besides, I've been cleaning your office for 3 years now." Thomas felt a flicker of discomfort. 3 years, and he'd never noticed. The man had never thought to. "Well, yes," he said stiffly. "The Henley-Nakamura simulations are proving challenging." Something flickered in Eddie's eyes. Interest? Understanding? Thomas couldn't quite place it. The universe doesn't give up its secrets easily, does it? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, Eddie said, resuming his work, moving the vacuum into position. Thomas blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the philosophical bent of the janitor's comment. "No," he agreed after a moment. "It certainly doesn't." He continued down the a hallway, the encounter already fading from his mind as he mentally reviewed the day's failures and planned tomorrow's approach. He didn't notice Eddie watching him go, a thoughtful expression on his face. The next morning brought more frustration. The simulations continued to crash at the same point, the equations refusing to resolve. By mid-afternoon, Thomas had worked himself into a state of tightly controlled anger. When a soft knock came at his door, he snapped, "What is it?" "Doctor." Victor Reynolds stepped in, his thin smile not reaching his eyes. As the newest tenured professor in the department, Reynolds had quickly established himself as both brilliant and ruthlessly ambitious. At 40, he was young enough to be hungry and established enough to be dangerous. "Trouble with the simulations?" Reynolds asked, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that set Thomas's teeth on edge. "Nothing insurmountable," Thomas replied. Coolly, Reynolds leaned against the doorframe, too casual, too familiar. "You know, there's growing consensus that the Henle-Nakamura paradox may be unsolvable with current mathematical frameworks. Kowalski's team at MIT published an interesting paper last month, suggesting we need an entirely new approach." "I read it," Thomas said. "It was speculative at best." "Perhaps," Reynolds conceded, "but innovative. Sometimes we need to consider that our established methods may be the very thing holding us back." He straightened. "The funding committee meets next week. I've submitted a proposal for a new direction in quantum field dynamics, one that doesn't rely on traditional computational methods." The implication hung in the air between them. Reynolds was positioning himself as the forward-thinking alternative to Thomas's increasingly stagnant research. After Reynolds left, Thomas sat rigid with anger. The younger man was right about one thing: the traditional approaches weren't working. But abandoning 30 years of methodologically sound research for untested theories felt like surrendering to mathematical mysticism. Thomas worked later than usual that night, refusing to concede defeat. The building emptied gradually, voices and footsteps fading until only the hum of the air conditioning remained. It was nearly 9 when he heard the familiar rattle of the janitorial cart outside his door. Eddie appeared a moment later, his expression registering surprise at finding Thomas still there. "You're burning the midnight oil, Professor." Thomas didn't look up from his screen. "Some problems require persistence." Eddie nodded, beginning his routine of emptying trash bins and wiping surfaces. "Mind if I ask what you're working on? I always wondered what keeps the lights on in here so late." Thomas nearly dismissed the question with a curt response about complex astrophysics being beyond a janitor's comprehension. But something, perhaps exhaustion, perhaps the isolation of the past weeks, loosened his tongue. "I'm attempting to resolve a paradox in quantum field theory as it relates to dark energy acceleration," he said, expecting Eddie's eyes to glaze over. Instead, the janitor tilted his head slightly. "The Henle-Nakamura paradox?" Thomas's fingers froze over his keyboard. He turned slowly. "You're familiar with it?" Eddie shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "I read the journals in the lounge during my breaks. Physics Today had a piece on it last year. Fascinating problem." "You read physics journals?" Thomas repeated, his tone flat with disbelief. "Among other things," Eddie said, returning to his gleaning. "The universe is a complex place. I like to keep up." Thomas watched as Eddie moved around the office with practiced efficiency. "And you understand what you read?" Eddie paused, a hint of amusement crossing his features. "Some days better than others. The math can get pretty dense." "The math?" Thomas echoed, struggling to reconcile the man in the janitorial uniform with someone who could follow the intimidating mathematics of advanced theoretical physics. Eddie finished with the trash and moved to leave. At the door, he hesitated. "If you don't mind me asking, where exactly are your simulations breaking down?" Thomas wasn't sure why he answered. Perhaps it was the strange unreality of discussing complex physics with a janitor at 9 in the evening. Perhaps it was the growing desperation of hitting the same wall for weeks. The equations collapse when modeling the interaction between dark energy expansion and quantum field fluctuations at the boundary conditions, he said. The values become nonsensical. Eddie nodded thoughtfully. Have you considered reframing the problem using non-Euclidean geometry? Sometimes, when Euclidean space creates singularities, a hyperbolic approach can reveal patterns that weren't visible before. Thomas stared. The suggestion wasn't merely coherent, it was sophisticated. That's a significant departure from established methods in the field. Sometimes you need to step outside the box, Eddie said simply, especially when the box keeps giving you impossible answers. He smiled. Just a thought. Good night, Professor. After Eddie left, Thomas sat motionless, unsettled in a way he couldn't quite articulate. The janitor's casual suggestion nagged at him, not because it was wrong, but because it reflected a level of understanding that seemed impossible given the man's position. He dismissed the encounter and returned to his work, but the seed had been planted. When his simulation crashed yet again at 11 p.m., Thomas found himself contemplating Eddie's suggestion despite himself. Non-Euclidean approaches were considered fringe in his field, the realm of speculative theorists rather than serious computational physicists. But at this point, what did he have to lose? Thomas began sketching a modified approach, converting his equations into a hyperbolic framework. It was nearly midnight when he ran the first test simulation. He expected another failure, another dead end. Instead, the computation proceeded past the previous failure point. The values stabilized. The equations didn't collapse. Thomas sat back, stunned. It couldn't be this simple. A janitor couldn't have casually solved a problem that had stumped him for months. It had to be a coincidence. Perhaps he had already been moving in this direction subconsciously. He ran additional simulations, tweaking parameters, testing boundary conditions. Each time, the results were stable. Not yet a solution to the paradox, but a path forward where before there had been only a wall. Thomas left the building at 2 a.m., his mind churning. He would need to refine the approach, thoroughly test it, ensure it wasn't generating stable but meaningless results. But for the first time in months, he felt the stirring of genuine excitement. He didn't see Eddie the next day, or the day after. The weekend came, and Thomas spent it entirely in his home office, refining his new approach. By Sunday night, he had preliminary results that suggested the non-Euclidean framework might indeed provide insights into the Henle-Nakamura paradox that conventional methods couldn't offer. Monday morning, Thomas arrived at his office earlier than usual, eager to continue. He was surprised to find Eleanor waiting for him, her expression grim. "There's been a complaint," she said without preamble. Thomas frowned. "What kind of complaint?" "From the facilities management department. Apparently, you've been engaging one of their staff in inappropriate conversations that interfere with their work duties." "What?" Thomas set down his briefcase slowly. "Are you referring to Eddie Santos?" Eleanor nodded. His supervisor reported that he's been spending excessive time in faculty offices, particularly yours, discussing matters outside his professional purview. "That's absurd," Thomas said. "We've had exactly one conversation about physics, which he initiated." "Nevertheless," Eleanor continued, "the complaint has been logged. Given your position and the current climate regarding power dynamics in the workplace, I suggest you maintain appropriate professional boundaries." She paused. "Perhaps it would be best to request a different custodial assignment for your office." Thomas felt a surge of indignation. The man made a helpful scientific suggestion. "I'm not going to have him reassigned for showing intellectual curiosity." Eleanor's eyebrows rose. A helpful scientific suggestion from a janitor? Yes, Thomas said firmly, surprising himself with his vehemence. A suggestion that has actually advanced my work on the Henle-Nakamura paradox. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Thomas, I understand the pressure you're under with the upcoming review, but claiming a breakthrough based on input from custodial staff seems, she chose her words carefully, unusual. I didn't say it was his breakthrough, Thomas clarified, irritation rising. I said his suggestion helped redirect my approach. The work is still mine. Of course, Eleanor said, clearly unconvinced. Well, the funding committee meets Friday. I hope you'll have something substantive to present. She headed for the door, then added, and please be mindful of the boundaries with support staff. After she left, Thomas sat fuming. The implication that he was somehow exploiting Eddie was ridiculous. If anything, the janitor had volunteered his insights without prompting. But beneath his irritation lay disquiet. Was he so desperate for a breakthrough that he was latching onto coincidental success following a casual suggestion? Was he giving credence to an unqualified source simply because he was out of options? Thomas spent the day meticulously testing his new approach, searching for flaws, for evidence that the apparent progress was illusory. By evening, he had to concede that the non-Euclidean framework was yielding genuinely promising results. The simulations were not only stable, but revealing patterns in the data that aligned with empirical observations of cosmic acceleration. He was deep in calculations when a now familiar voice came from the doorway. Making progress, Professor. Eddie stood there, mop in hand, his expression friendly but cautious. Thomas hesitated, Eleanor's warning fresh in his mind. But academic politics had never dictated his intellectual engagements before, and he wasn't about to let it start now. Actually, yes, he said, gesturing to his screen. Your suggestion about non-Euclidean geometry has proven fruitful. Eddie's face brightened. Really? That's great. Sometimes a fresh perspective is all it takes. Thomas studied the janitor with new intensity. Where did you learn about non-Euclidean approaches to quantum field theory? That's not exactly casual reading. Eddie's smile faded slightly. He leaned his mop against the wall and pulled a small, worn notebook from his back pocket. I've been working on some ideas of my own, he said, sounding almost apologetic. Nothing formal, just thoughts. May I? Thomas held out his hand. Eddie hesitated, then passed over the notebook. Thomas opened it and found himself looking at page after page of dense mathematical notations. Equations, diagrams, derivations, all handwritten in a neat, precise script. He flipped through slowly, his disbelief growing with each page. You wrote all this? He asked, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice. Over the years, yes, Eddie confirmed. Math helps me think. Thomas reached a section specifically, addressing the Henle-Nakamura paradox. The approach laid out was similar to what he'd been implementing, based on Eddie's suggestion, but taken further, exploring implications he hadn't yet considered. This is... Thomas searched for the right word, unexpected. Eddie laughed softly. That's one way to put it. Where did you study? Thomas asked, still paging through the notebook. A shadow crossed Eddie's face. I didn't. Not formally. Life took a different turn. Thomas looked up sharply. You're self-taught? In theoretical physics and advanced mathematics? Books, journals, online courses when I can afford them? Eddie shrugged. The university library has been a godsend. And the physics department lounge tosses out some great journals still in their wrappers. Thomas closed the notebook and handed it back, his world shifting subtly on its axis. Why are you working as a janitor when you can do this? He gestured to the notebook. Eddie's expression shuttered slightly. Not everyone gets the same opportunities, Professor. I had my daughter young, single parent, had to prioritize stable work with benefits over education. A hint of pride entered his voice. Sophia's a sophomore at community college now, first in our family to go beyond high school. Thomas nodded slowly, a discomforting realization dawning. How many Eddies were out there? How many brilliant minds were emptying trash bins and mopping floors simply because life had dealt them a different hand? Would you be willing to share your work on the paradox? Thomas asked. I'd like to review it more thoroughly. Eddie hesitated. I'm not looking to intrude on your research, Dr. Mitchell. I know how academia works. Publication, credit, tenure. It's a complicated world. I'm not asking to take credit for your ideas, Thomas said stiffly. I'm offering to review them, as I would for any colleague with interesting work. Eddie's eyes widened slightly at the word colleague. After a moment, he nodded. I can make copies of the relevant sections. Thank you, Thomas said, surprised to find he meant it. The next day, a manila envelope appeared on Thomas's desk. Inside were photocopied pages from Eddie's notebook, along with additional notes expanding on several key concepts. Thomas spent the entire day absorbed in the janitor's work, his astonishment growing hour by hour. Eddie's approach wasn't just innovative, it was revolutionary. The mathematical framework he'd developed sidestepped the conventional assumptions that had constrained the field for decades. His treatment of quantum field fluctuations in expanding space-time revealed patterns that conventional methods obscured. And most surprisingly, his mathematics was rigorous. This wasn't the work of a dilettante or a mathematical mystic. The derivations were sound, the logic impeccable. Eddie Santos, janitor at Westbridge University, had independently developed a theoretical framework that might crack one of the most stubborn problems in contemporary physics. Thomas found himself at a crossroads. The funding committee meeting was 2 days away. Reynolds was circling like a shark, ready to declare Thomas's approach a dead end and position himself as the department's new leading theorist. Thomas's reputation, his funding, his position of authority, all hung in the balance. And here in his hands was a potential breakthrough. Not his breakthrough, but one he could understand, validate, and present. Who would question his claim to it? A janitor with no formal education, no institutional standing, no credibility in academic circles. The thought formed with such clarity that it shocked him. Was he really considering passing off Eddie's work as his own? The Thomas Mitchell of last week, controlled, certain, coldly logical, might have justified it as bringing important work into the light. After all, what chance did Eddie have of ever publishing in a peer-reviewed journal? But the Thomas, who had spent hours engrossed in the janitor's brilliance, couldn't stomach the thought. There was a term for what he'd been considering: intellectual theft, and no amount of rationalization could disguise it. That evening, Thomas waited for Eddie to appear with his cart. When the janitor arrived, Thomas invited him in and closed the door. Your work, Thomas began, gesturing to the photocopied pages spread across his desk, is exceptional. Eddie's expression revealed a complex mix of pride and uncertainty. Thank you. That means a lot coming from you. It's not just good, Eddie. It's potentially groundbreaking. Thomas took a deep breath. The approach you've developed could resolve aspects of the Henle-Nakamura paradox that have stymied the field for years. Eddie blinked, seemingly unable to process the validation. Really? I mean, I thought it made sense, but I never had anyone qualified to review it. It more than makes sense, Thomas said. It opens new avenues for exploration that conventional approaches miss entirely. He hesitated. There's a funding committee meeting on Friday. I'd like to present some of these findings with full attribution to you, of course. Eddie's eyes widened. You want to present my work? To the committee? With your permission, Thomas clarified, and your participation if you're willing. My participation, Eddie repeated, as if the words didn't compute. Yes, Thomas said firmly. This is your work. You should present it. Eddie let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Dr. Mitchell, I appreciate the thought, but I'm the guy who empties your trash bin. No funding committee is going to take me seriously. They'll take the mathematics seriously, Thomas insisted. And they'll take you seriously when I endorse your work. Eddie stared at him for a long moment. Why would you do that? You don't owe me anything. Thomas considered the question carefully. Because it's the right thing to do, he said finally. And because your work deserves to be recognized. Eddie sat down heavily in the chair across from Thomas's desk. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Thomas replied simply. Eddie ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, visibly processing the surreal turn of events. What about your own research? Your position here? My position, Thomas said with sudden clarity, is secure enough to acknowledge brilliance when I encounter it, regardless of its source. He leaned forward. The question is whether you're prepared for what might come next. Academic recognition brings scrutiny. There will be questions about your background, your methods, your lack of formal credentials. Eddie's jaw set. I can defend the math, the rest. He shrugged. Doesn't matter as much as people think. Thomas nodded, a new respect forming. Then we have work to do before Friday. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Thomas cleared his schedule, cancelling a guest lecture and 2 committee meetings to focus entirely on helping Eddie organize his findings into a coherent presentation. They worked side by side, professor and janitor, united by a shared language of mathematics and a problem that transcended their different stations. Eddie proved a quick study in academic presentation formats. His innate understanding of the material meant he needed little coaching on content, mainly refinement of terminology and anticipation of the committee's likely questions. What struck Thomas most was Eddie's pure joy in the work, his unabashed excitement at exploring ideas without concern for academic politics or career advancement. When Friday morning arrived, Thomas met Eddie outside Matheson Hall. The janitor had traded his blue uniform for a modest button-down shirt and khakis, the best he could manage on short notice. Nervous? Thomas asked. Eddie laughed shakily. Terrified, but in a good way. They walked together to the administration building, an odd pair drawing curious glances. In the elevator, Eddie turned to Thomas. Whatever happens in there, thank you for seeing the math instead of just the mop. Thomas felt a twist of shame, knowing how easily he might have missed this moment, how close he had come to dismissing the janitor without a second thought. I'm a slow learner, he admitted, but I get there eventually. The committee room was arranged like a small amphitheater, a semicircle of tables facing a presentation screen. 8 people waited. Eleanor Winters, 3 senior faculty members, the dean, and 3 representatives from various funding bodies. Their expressions registered surprise as Thomas entered with Eddie. Dr. Mitchell, Eleanor began. We weren't expecting an additional presenter. A last-minute development, Thomas replied smoothly. May I introduce Edward Santos? He'll be presenting today's findings. Victor Reynolds, seated at the far end, laughed outright. Isn't he on the custodial staff? He is, Thomas confirmed. He's also a brilliant theoretical physicist whose work on the Henle-Nakamura paradox represents a significant breakthrough. The room fell silent, faces showing emotions ranging from confusion to disbelief to outright skepticism. Thomas, Dean Wallace said carefully, this is highly irregular. Adul, so is discovering groundbreaking mathematical frameworks from unexpected sources, Thomas countered. I've thoroughly reviewed Mr. Santos's work. I stand behind its validity and importance. Eleanor studied Thomas's face, searching for signs of a breakdown or an elaborate joke. Finding neither, she nodded slowly. "Very well. Let's proceed." Eddie stepped forward, nervous but determined. He connected his USB drive to the computer, and his carefully prepared slides appeared on the screen. The title page read simply, "A Non-Euclidean Approach to the Henle-Nakamura Paradox" by Eddie Santos. "Good morning," Eddie began, his voice soft but steady. "Thank you for the opportunity to present my work." What followed was 20 minutes of the clearest, most insightful explanation of quantum field theory in expanding space-time that Thomas had ever witnessed. Eddie's lack of academic jargon was not a handicap, but an asset. He expressed complex concepts with refreshing clarity, guided by intuitive understanding rather than rote learning. The committee's skepticism visibly wavered, then crumbled as Eddie walked them through his mathematical framework step by step. By the time he reached his key findings, even Reynolds had stopped smirking and was taking notes. When Eddie finished, there was a moment of profound silence. Then the questions began, tentative at first, then increasingly engaged. Eddie answered each with the confidence of someone who truly understood his material, unhindered by academic ego or territorial defensiveness. "Where did you study, Mr. Santos?" One of the funding representatives finally asked, the question they'd all been avoiding. "I'm self-taught," Eddie replied simply. "Life circumstances prevented formal education, but not learning." "And how did this collaboration with Dr. Mitchell come about?" Eleanor asked, her gaze shifting between the two men. "We met while I was cleaning his office," Eddie said with a small smile. "A conversation about physics led to an exchange of ideas. Dr. Mitchell was kind enough to review my work and suggest this presentation." Thomas cleared his throat. "I want to be absolutely clear," he said. "This framework is entirely Mr. Santos's creation. My role has been limited to review and validation. The breakthrough is his." The committee exchanged glances, processing this unprecedented situation. "While this is certainly unusual," Dean Wallace finally said, "the work speaks for itself. Mr. Santos, would you be open to further development of these ideas under formal association with the university?" Eddie blinked. "What kind of association?" "That would depend on various factors," the dean hedged, "but given Dr. Mitchell's endorsement and the quality of your work, we might explore options for special research status, perhaps leading to more formal positions over time." Eddie's expression showed both hope and wariness. "I'd be interested in discussing possibilities, but I have responsibilities, my daughter's education, my current position." "Details to address later," Thomas interjected. "For now, the committee should consider the merits of the research itself and whether it warrants funding." The funding representatives huddled together briefly. Then the lead representative spoke. "We would like to see a more comprehensive written proposal, but based on today's presentation, we're prepared to provisionally allocate exploratory funding to develop these ideas further." Eddie's face showed stunned disbelief. Thomas felt an unexpected surge of pride, not in his own judgment, but in Eddie's achievement. As the meeting concluded, committee members approached Eddie individually, business cards extended, questions flowing. Thomas stepped back, watching as the janitor, who had been invisible to most of these people days earlier, was now the center of their attention. Eleanor appeared at Thomas's side. "Well," she said quietly, "this is not how I expected the meeting to go." "Nor I," Thomas admitted. "You could have claimed his work as your own," she observed. "No one would have questioned it." Thomas met her gaze directly. "I would have known." She studied him. The Thomas Mitchell of last year might have made a different choice. "Then I'm glad he's not here anymore," Thomas replied. As they prepared to leave, Eddie broke away from his new admirers and approached Thomas. "I don't know what to say," he began. "You don't need to say anything," Thomas assured him. "This is just the beginning." Eddie shook his head, eyes bright. "With emotion. You didn't have to do any of this. You could have used my ideas and never mentioned my name." "That thought occurred to me," Thomas admitted, "but some equations balance in only one way." Eddie nodded, understanding the mathematical metaphor for moral clarity. As they walked out together, Thomas's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number with a NASA prefix. Frowning, he answered. "Dr. Mitchell, this is James Harrington from Glenn Research Center." The voice was urgent, excited. "I've just heard about the presentation at Westbridge. We need to talk immediately about Eddie Santos's framework." Thomas looked at Eddie, whose eyes had widened at the mention of NASA. "He's actually right here with me." "Put me on speaker," Harrington demanded. Thomas complied, holding out the phone between them. "Mr. Santos," Harrington's voice crackled, "your approach to quantum field fluctuations in expanding space-time has immediate applications to our work on interstellar propulsion systems. The mathematical framework you've developed might solve stability issues we've been battling for years." Eddie stared at the phone in disbelief. "Are you serious?" "Deadly serious," Harrington confirmed. "I'm catching the next flight to meet with you both. This could change everything." After the call ended, Eddie and Thomas stood in silence on the steps of the administration building. The spring sun warmed their faces, and students hurried past, unaware of the moment unfolding. "NASA," Eddie finally whispered. "They want my formula." Thomas nodded. "Your life is about to change." Eddie looked down at his hands that had mopped floors and emptied trash for years, while his mind soared through the cosmos. "I don't know if I'm ready. Few of us are ready for the moments that define us," Thomas said. "We simply meet them as best we can." Eddie took a deep breath. "My night shift starts in 4 hours." Thomas couldn't help but laugh. "I think you might need to call in sick. We have a NASA meeting to prepare for." As they walked together, across the campus, the distinguished professor and the janitor, whose brilliance had been hidden in plain sight, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the pure, uncomplicated joy of discovery. Not the carefully measured satisfaction of adding another publication to his CV or another award to his shelf, but the wonder of encountering something truly unexpected. He had spent decades building walls around his work, around his reputation, around himself. It had taken a janitor with a worn notebook to show him that sometimes the most remarkable breakthroughs happen when those walls come down. By midnight, James Harrington and 2 NASA colleagues had arrived at Westbridge University, their hastily booked red-eye flight landing them in a state of caffeine-fueled excitement. They convened in Thomas's office, the only space available, at such late notice, with cups of vending machine coffee and the intensity of people who knew they were on the verge of something momentous. Eddie Santos sat at the center of this unlikely gathering, his worn notebook open on the desk, surrounded by some of the finest scientific minds in the country. The janitor uniform had been replaced with borrowed clothes, a button-down shirt that hung slightly loose on his frame, and khaki pants held up by a belt cinched tight. Despite the awkward fit, Eddie carried himself with a quiet dignity that commanded attention. "Walk us through the derivation again," Harrington urged, leaning forward, his silver-rimmed glasses sliding down his nose. "The transition from standard quantum field equations to your hyperbolic framework, that's the key insight we're missing." Eddie nodded, flipping to a densely notated page in his notebook. The traditional approach treats space-time as fundamentally Euclidean at quantum scales, even while acknowledging its curvature at macro scales. That creates an irreconcilable mathematical tension. His fingers traced a series of equations. If we instead accept hyperbolic geometry as fundamental at all scales, the equations simplify remarkably. Thomas watched in growing amazement as Eddie guided the NASA team through his mathematical framework with natural ease. There was no hint of intimidation in the janitor's manner, just the pure pleasure of discussing ideas with people who understood them. Here was a man who had spent years thinking deeply in isolation, suddenly given the gift of intellectual communion. Harrington scribbled furiously in his own notebook, occasionally exchanging glances with his colleagues. This has implications far beyond theoretical astrophysics, he said finally. Your framework could revolutionize our approach to propulsion, systems for deep space exploration. How so? Eddie asked, genuinely curious. Our current designs hit a theoretical wall when scaling up to speeds necessary for efficient interstellar travel, Harrington explained. The energy requirements become prohibitive because we're working within conventional physical frameworks. But your approach suggests a different relationship between energy, mass, and space-time at quantum scales, one that might allow for substantially more efficient propulsion systems. As the night deepened toward dawn, they worked through the implications, filling whiteboards with equations and diagrams. Thomas found himself in an unusual position, not leading, but observing, occasionally clarifying a point or suggesting a connection. For the first time in decades, he was learning rather than instructing, and the sensation was surprisingly exhilarating. Around 5 in the morning, Eleanor Winters arrived, summoned by Thomas's urgent text. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the scene, the disheveled NASA scientists, Eddie at the whiteboard, Thomas absorbed in calculations at his desk. I see the rumors weren't exaggerated, she said finally. Harrington turned, recognizing her. Dr. Winters, good. We're going to need departmental cooperation to move quickly on this. Mr. Santos needs research space, computational resources, and institutional support. Eleanor blinked, still processing the surreal tableau before her, all for a theory presented yesterday by a member of our custodial staff. A theory, Harrington corrected her, that may advance NASA's propulsion capabilities by decades. Mr. Santos has agreed to collaborate with our team at Glenn Research Center, but we'd prefer to establish a joint research initiative with Westbridge. Eleanor looked at Thomas, who nodded almost imperceptibly. She turned back to Harrington. I'll speak with the dean as soon as his office opens. In the meantime, she hesitated, then turned to Eddie. Mr. Santos, I believe we owe you an apology for overlooking your talents for so long. And my personal thanks for your patience. Eddie's expression softened. No apology needed, Dr. Winters. We all have our paths. By 7, the overnight session concluded, with plans for Eddie to visit NASA's facilities the following week. As the others filed out to find breakfast and much-needed rest, Thomas found himself alone with Eddie for the first time since the whirlwind had begun. How are you holding up? Thomas asked. Eddie ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion finally showing in the shadows beneath his eyes. It doesn't seem real. Yesterday morning I was mopping floors. Today NASA wants my equations. He laughed quietly. I keep waiting for someone to tell me there's been a mistake. There's no mistake, Thomas assured him. Your work is extraordinary. The only error was the system that failed to recognize your potential earlier. Eddie shook his head. I made my choices, Dr. Mitchell. When Sophia came along, stability mattered more than ambition. Your daughter, Thomas remembered. Does she know what's happening? A smile transformed Eddie's tired face. I called her during a break. She thought I was joking at first. His eyes grew distant. Then she cried, said she always knew I was smart enough to be more than... He stopped himself. More than a janitor, Thomas finished quietly. Eddie met his gaze directly. There's honor in all work, Dr. Mitchell. I've never been ashamed of what I do, but I won't deny I've dreamed of this, of being taken seriously as a thinker, not just a maintenance worker." Thomas nodded, feeling a fresh wave of respect for the man before him. "You should go home, get some rest. Tomorrow will bring more challenges." "My shift starts at noon," Eddie said automatically, then paused, reality catching up with him. "I suppose I need to talk to my supervisor." "I'll handle that," Thomas said. "Starting today, you're a special research fellow in the physics department. Your only job is developing your theoretical framework." Eddie stood, swaying slightly with fatigue. "Thank you, Dr. Mitchell, for seeing me." After Eddie left, Thomas remained in his office, watching the morning sun illuminate the campus. Students began to appear on the paths below, hurrying to early. Glasses, unaware that the universe as understood by physics had shifted slightly overnight. His phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Dean-approved emergency research appointment for Santos. Reynolds wants meeting ASAP. Prepare for turbulence." Thomas smiled grimly. Of course, Victor Reynolds would be troubled by these developments. The younger professor had been positioning himself as the department's innovative future. Now a janitor had upended the entire hierarchy with a notebook full of equations that none of them had imagined. The turbulence arrived sooner than expected. Thomas had barely returned from a quick breakfast when Reynolds appeared in his doorway, his thin face taut with barely controlled anger. "This is highly irregular, even for you," Reynolds said without preamble. "Presenting a janitor to the funding committee, summoning NASA for a midnight consultation. The entire department is buzzing with rumors." Thomas regarded him calmly. "Not rumors, Victor. Facts. Edward Santos has developed a mathematical framework that may resolve significant aspects of the Henle-Nakamura paradox. NASA believes it has practical applications for their propulsion research." "And you're vouching for this work?" Reynolds pressed, stepping further into the office. "Staking your reputation on equations scribbled in a janitor's notebook?" "I am," Thomas confirmed, "after thorough review." Reynolds shook his head incredulously. "Have you considered the possibility that you've been misled? That perhaps Mr. Santos has appropriated these ideas from somewhere else? A man with no formal training suddenly produces breakthrough mathematics in theoretical physics. It strains credibility." "I've considered every possibility," Thomas said, his voice cooling. "I've tested the mathematics, verified the derivations, and witnessed Mr. Santos explain his framework with a depth of understanding that can't be faked. His work is original and significant. The department is taking an enormous risk," Reynolds insisted. "If this turns out to be flawed, or worse, fraudulent, the embarrassment will be considerable." "Then it's fortunate that the risk falls. Primarily on my reputation, not yours," Thomas said pointedly. "Unless your concern runs deeper than academic integrity." Reynolds flushed. "What are you implying?" "Simply that your recent grant proposal focused on new directions in quantum field dynamics. Perhaps you're concerned that Santos's breakthrough might overshadow your own work." The younger professor straightened, his expression hardening. "That's beneath you, Thomas. My concern is for the department's standing. But if you're determined to champion this unconventional talent, don't expect the rest of us to participate in the fallout if it goes wrong." After Reynolds left, Thomas sat motionless, contemplating the challenges ahead. The academic world could be ruthlessly hierarchical. Eddie Santos would face scrutiny not just of his mathematics, but of his very right to participate in the field without the proper credentials. The janitor's path would not be easy, despite the brilliance of his work. By afternoon, news of the extraordinary developments had spread beyond Westbridge. Thomas's email inbox filled with messages from colleagues at other institutions, some expressing curiosity, others skepticism, a few outright dismissal of the idea that a self-taught janitor could contribute meaningfully to theoretical physics. One email in particular caught his attention, from Dr. Miyako Tanaka at MIT, a respected physicist who had done pioneering work on quantum field theory. This sounds reminiscent of Ramanujan's story. I would be interested in reviewing Mr. Santos's work. If it's as groundbreaking as suggested, we should ensure it receives proper attention, regardless of its unconventional origins. The reference to Srinivasa Ramanujan, the self-taught Indian mathematician whose genius had revolutionized number theory in the early 20th century, despite his lack of formal training, was apt. Like Ramanujan, Eddie had developed his insights in isolation, working from first principles rather than established doctrine, and like Ramanujan, he would need champions within the academic establishment to ensure his work wasn't dismissed due to his background. Thomas was drafting a response to Dr. Tanaka when his office phone rang. The caller ID showed Westbridge's main switchboard. "Dr. Mitchell, we have a call from a Sophia Santos who insists on speaking with you. She says it's regarding her father, Edward Santos." "Put her through," Thomas said immediately. There was a click, then a young woman's voice, breathless and tense. "Dr. Mitchell, this is Sophia Santos. I'm looking for my dad. He's not answering his phone, and he never came home this morning. This isn't like him at all." Thomas frowned. "We finished our meeting around 7. He was heading home to rest." "Well, he never made it," Sophia said, worry sharpening her tone. "And given everything that's happening, it's just not like him to disappear. Not without telling me. Have you checked with his supervisor at facilities management? Maybe he went to discuss his situation." "I called. They said he hasn't been in today, and that they received notice from the physics department about his new position." Her voice caught slightly. "Is that real? Is my dad really going to be working with NASA?" "It's real," Thomas confirmed. "Your father's work is exceptional, Sophia. He should be very proud, and you as well." There was a brief silence. "He used to help me with my math homework," she said finally, her voice softer. "The teachers always thought I was cheating because a janitor's daughter couldn't possibly understand calculus that well. But Dad could explain it in ways that made it simple, made it beautiful." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. "We'll find him, Sophia. Why don't you come to my office? We can coordinate from here." 20 minutes later, Sophia Santos arrived, a slender young woman with her father's thoughtful eyes and an intensity that suggested she'd grown up quickly. She wore jeans and a community college sweatshirt, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "He was so excited when he called last night," she said, pacing Thomas's office, "talking about hyperbolic geometry and NASA and research fellowships. I thought maybe he was having some kind of episode. Dad's brilliant, but this seemed unbelievable," Thomas suggested. She nodded. "Then he mentioned your name, said you'd helped make it happen. That's why I called you when I couldn't find him." "When did you last hear from him?" "Around 3 this morning. He said they were taking a break, that you were all still working through the implications of his equations." Sophia stopped pacing, fixing Thomas with a direct gaze. "Something's wrong, I can feel it." Thomas hesitated, reluctant to fuel her anxiety, but unwilling to dismiss her concerns. "Let me make some calls. In the meantime, is there anywhere he might go to think?" "A favorite place?" Sophia considered. "The university library, the astronomy section on the 4th floor. He goes there during his lunch break sometimes just to read the new journals." Thomas nodded. "I'll have security check." "What about friends, other family members?" "It's just been the 2 of us since Mom left when I was 5, Sophia said quietly. "And Dad keeps to himself mostly. His colleagues at facilities like him, but they don't really know him, the real him." As Thomas reached for his phone, it buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced down and felt a chill spread through him. The text was from Eleanor. Reynolds claims Santos's work contains serious errors. Called Special Meeting of Senior Faculty. 3 p.m. Your presence required. Thomas looked up to find Sophia watching him intently. "What is it?" she asked. "Did someone find him?" "No," Thomas said carefully, "but there appears to be complication with your father's research. A colleague is raising questions about its validity." Sophia's expression hardened. "Which colleague?" "Dr. Victor Reynolds. The one with the receding hairline and the designer glasses always has a leather messenger bag?" Thomas blinked in surprise. "You know him?" "I know of him," Sophia corrected. "Dad mentioned him once. Said he was brilliant but insecure, that he'd rather tear down others' work than risk having his own criticized." She crossed her arms. "What's he saying about Dad's research?" "I don't know the specifics yet," Thomas admitted. "There's a meeting at 3 to discuss it." Sophia checked her watch. "That's in 40 minutes. I'm coming with you." "Sophia, these faculty meetings are generally closed to—" "My father is missing," she interrupted, her voice steady but intense. "His work is being questioned in his absence. I'm coming with you, Dr. Mitchell. You can introduce me as his research assistant, if necessary." Thomas studied the determined young woman before him and saw in her the same quiet strength he'd recognized in Eddie. "Very well," he conceded. "But first, let's check the library." The astronomy section of Westbridge's library was a quiet corner of the massive 4th floor, its shelves lined with journals and texts ranging from introductory astronomy to advanced astrophysics. The area was deserted when Thomas and Sophia arrived. No sign of Eddie among the reading tables or in the aisles between shelves. As they were about to leave, Sophia paused at one of the tables, picking up a scrap of paper left behind. "This is Dad's handwriting," she said, showing Thomas what appeared to be a sequence of equations jotted hastily in the margins of a library notepad. Thomas studied the notations. They aligned with the framework Eddie had presented, but with additional elements, refinements or extensions he hadn't shared in their overnight session. "He was here," Thomas confirmed. "Recently, from the look of it. These build on what he showed us last night." Sophia slipped the paper into her pocket. "So where did he go after?" They made their way to the faculty meeting room, arriving just as senior members of the physics department were filing in. Eleanor intercepted them at the door, her eyebrows rising at the sight of Sophia. "Ms. Santos, I presume," she said. "I'm Dr. Winters, department chair. We're very concerned about your father's whereabouts." "Then why are you holding a meeting to question his work while he's missing?" Sophia asked bluntly. Eleanor had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Dr. Reynolds raised concerns that require immediate attention, given the high-profile nature of your father's claims and NASA's involvement." "They're not claims," Thomas interjected. "I've verified the mathematics myself." "Nevertheless," Eleanor continued, "we need to address Dr. Reynolds' analysis. The department's reputation is at stake." Inside, the large conference table was nearly full. Victor Reynolds sat at the far end, a stack of papers before him, his expression one of grim satisfaction. He glanced up as Thomas and Sophia entered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Miss Santos will be joining us," Thomas announced, pulling out a chair for her beside his own. "As Mr. Santos is currently unavailable, his daughter will represent his interests." Reynolds started to object, but Eleanor cut him off with a raised hand. "Under the circumstances, I think we can allow it." She addressed the room. "Let's begin. Dr. Reynolds has raised concerns about the mathematical framework presented by Edward Santos yesterday. Dr. Reynolds, please elaborate." Reynolds stood, distributing copies of a document to those around the table. "After reviewing the notes from Mr. Santos's presentation, I identified several critical flaws in his approach. Specifically, his transition from standard quantum field theory to a hyperbolic framework introduces mathematical inconsistencies that render his conclusions invalid. Thomas accepted a copy of Reynolds's analysis, scanning it quickly. The document was impressive in its thoroughness, pages of dense mathematical critique that would take hours to properly evaluate. "When did you prepare this?" Thomas asked. "Mr. Santos only presented his work yesterday." Reynolds smiled thinly. "I worked through the night. Unlike some, I take the department's reputation seriously." "Or perhaps," Thomas suggested, "you had a vested interest in discrediting work that might overshadow your own research directions." A murmur ran through the assembled faculty. Reynolds flushed but held his ground. "The mathematics speaks for itself, Thomas. The Santos framework contains fundamental errors that any trained physicist would recognize, which raises the question, how did you miss them? Or did you simply want this janitor's story to be true so badly that you overlooked the flaws?" Before Thomas could respond, Sophia stood. "May I address the room?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "Briefly, Ms. Santos. My father taught himself theoretical physics by reading journals discarded in this department's lounge," Sophia began, her voice steady despite the hostility directed her way. "He worked night shifts so he could study during the day. He solved practice problems from textbooks while eating lunch alone. He did all this not for recognition or career advancement, but because he loves the elegance of the universe's laws." She pulled the scrap of paper from her pocket. "This morning, he was in the library, continuing to refine his work. Now he's missing, and instead of helping find him, you're attacking his research in his absence." The room fell silent. Even Reynolds seemed momentarily discomfited. "No one is attacking your father," Eleanor said finally. "We're simply examining his work with appropriate scientific rigor." "The same rigor you'd apply to a colleague with a PhD and tenure?" Sophia challenged. "Ms. Santos," Reynolds interjected, "scientific truth isn't determined by personal narratives or appeals to emotion. The mathematics either works or it doesn't. I've demonstrated conclusively that your father's approach contains critical errors." Thomas, who had been carefully reviewing Reynolds' critique during this exchange, looked up. "No, Victor, you haven't." All eyes turned to him. "Your analysis," Thomas continued, "is based on an incomplete understanding of Mr. Santos's framework. You've critiqued the notes from yesterday's presentation, but those represent only a fraction of his complete approach." He turned to Sophia. "May I see that paper again?" She handed it over. Thomas studied the equations, then held up the scrap for the room to see. "These are extensions of the framework Mr. Santos presented yesterday, refinements that address precisely the inconsistencies Dr. Reynolds has identified." Reynolds scoffed. "Convenient timing. A mysterious scrap of paper appears just as flaws in the original work are exposed." "The paper was in the astronomy library," Thomas countered, "written in Mr. Santos's hand, continuing the work he began years ago, work that, despite your overnight efforts, you've only partially understood." "This is absurd," Reynolds sputtered. "Are we really going to take seriously the scribblings of a man with no formal training based on a paper scrap conveniently discovered by his daughter?" A new voice entered the conversation from the doorway. "Perhaps you'd prefer to evaluate the complete framework as explained by its author." All heads turned. Eddie Santos stood in the entrance, disheveled and tired-looking, but very much present. Behind him was James Harrington from NASA, along with another man Thomas didn't recognize. "Dad!" Sophia rushed across the room, embracing her father fiercely. Eddie hugged her, then addressed the room. "I apologize for my absence. After leaving campus this morning, I realized there were aspects of my approach that needed refinement before formal presentation. I went to the library, then to a coffee shop to work through the implications. He gestured to Harrington. Dr. Harrington found me there and brought an unexpected visitor. The unknown man stepped forward, elderly, distinguished, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. Professor Henry Nakamura, he introduced himself, co-creator of the paradox Mr. Santos's work addresses. When NASA contacted me about a potential breakthrough, I flew in immediately to review it myself. A stunned silence fell over the room. Nakamura was a legend in the field, one of the foundational figures in modern theoretical physics. His presence lent instant credibility to the proceedings. And having reviewed Mr. Santos's complete framework, Nakamura continued, I find it not only sound, but potentially revolutionary. The hyperbolic approach resolves mathematical tensions that have confounded us for decades. Reynolds remained defiant. With all due respect, Professor Nakamura, the inconsistencies I've identified are addressed in the complete framework, Nakamura interrupted gently. Your analysis, while impressively thorough for an overnight effort, examines only a portion of Mr. Santos's approach. The mathematical elegance of the full system becomes apparent when viewed in its entirety. Reynolds sank slowly back into his chair, his critique crumbling before the weight of Nakamura's authority. Eddie stepped further into the room, his arm still around his daughter's shoulders. I understand the skepticism, he said, addressing the assembled faculty. I would question this too in your position. A janitor with no formal training, claiming to resolve a paradox that has challenged the field for years. It sounds impossible. He smiled slightly. But mathematics doesn't care about credentials. It cares about truth. And sometimes truth comes from unexpected places. Thomas watched the room's reaction, faces shifting from doubt to curiosity, from dismissal to consideration. Eddie Santos stood before them, not as a janitor now, but as a theorist, defending his work with quiet confidence. The transformation was remarkable to witness. I propose, Thomas said into the silence, that we adjourn this meeting and reconvene tomorrow. Professor Nakamura, Dr. Harrington, and Mr. Santos can present the complete framework, and we can evaluate it properly with open minds and scientific rigor. Eleanor nodded, relieved at the diplomatic solution. Agreed. We'll meet. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. in the large lecture hall. Mr. Santos, I hope you'll prepare a comprehensive presentation of your work. As the meeting dispersed, Eddie approached Thomas, Sophia still at his side. Thank you, he said simply, for defending my work when I wasn't here to do it myself. Your mathematics speaks for itself, Thomas replied. I just made sure it was heard. Nakamura joined them, his eyes alight with intellectual excitement. Mr. Santos, your approach reminds me of Ramanujan, the intuitive leaps, the fresh perspective unconstrained by conventional training. We must discuss your background further. How did you develop these insights in isolation? As Eddie began, explaining his self-education to the renowned physicist, Thomas stepped back, watching the interaction with a strange mixture of pride and humility. 24 hours ago, he had dismissed Eddie Santos as just another member of the university's invisible support staff. Now the janitor was deep in conversation with one of the greatest minds in theoretical physics, discussing ideas that might reshape humanity's understanding of the universe. The academic hierarchy that had defined Thomas's world for decades suddenly seemed arbitrary, a system that valued credentials over insight, orthodoxy over innovation. How many other brilliant minds remained undiscovered because they lacked the right pedigree or opportunity? Sophia approached him as her father and Nakamura became absorbed in a technical discussion. Dr. Mitchell, she said quietly, when Dad called last night, he told me something I didn't understand until now. He said, "You were the first person to see him as a physicist rather than a janitor. That means everything to him." Thomas shook his head slightly. "I was slow to see it, Sophia. The truth is, your father was a physicist all along. The rest of us just hadn't noticed yet." As they left the conference room, Thomas found himself in an unexpected role, not the distinguished professor leading the way, but a student learning that brilliance could emerge from the most unlikely sources, and that sometimes the greatest insights come not from those trained to find them, but from those who see the world through fresh eyes. The sun was setting over Westbridge's campus, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, presenting Eddie's complete framework to the department, navigating academic politics, establishing formal research, relationships with NASA. But today had marked a fundamental shift, not just for Eddie Santos, but for Thomas Mitchell as well. For the first time in years, Thomas felt the pure exhilaration of discovery, not of a new equation or theory, but of a more profound truth, that the universe reveals its secrets to those who listen, regardless of their title or training. And, while he had spent decades building his reputation as someone who knew all the answers, perhaps his greatest contribution would be recognizing the answer when it came from an unexpected source. As he watched Eddie and Nakamura walk ahead, deep in animated conversation, Thomas found himself smiling. The janitor, who had been invisible, now stood at the center of attention, illuminated not by the fading sunlight, but by the brightness of his own mind finally recognized. Morning light streamed through the tall windows of Westbridge University's largest lecture hall, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny galaxies. The room had been designed to accommodate 300 students, but today it held something far more unusual. An audience of distinguished physicists, NASA officials, university administrators, and curious faculty from other departments. All gathered to witness what might be a pivotal moment in theoretical physics. In the front row, Sophia Santos sat with perfect posture, her eyes never leaving the stage where her father stood beside a projection screen. Eddie had traded his customary blue uniform for a borrowed blazer that hung slightly loose on his shoulders. Despite this sartorial upgrade, there was nothing pretentious about his demeanor. He moved with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized his work as a janitor, now applied to the arrangement of his presentation materials. Thomas Mitchell observed from the side of the room, deliberately positioning himself away from the spotlight. This was Eddie's moment, not his. Beside him stood Professor Nakamura, the legendary physicist's eyes bright with intellectual excitement as Eddie began to speak. "Good morning," Eddie said, his voice steady despite the pressure of the moment. "I appreciate your willingness to consider my work, especially given its unconventional origins." A gentle murmur of laughter rippled through the audience. "Today, I'll present a complete overview of what I've come to call the hyperbolic framework for quantum field dynamics in expanding spacetime. I'll begin with the fundamental premises, then demonstrate how this approach resolves key aspects of the Henle-Nakamura paradox. What followed was perhaps the most unusual physics lecture in Westbridge's history. Eddie Santos, who had never taken a formal university course, delivered a masterclass in theoretical astrophysics with the natural confidence of someone explaining their life's passion. His approach was refreshingly direct, unburdened by academic jargon or the need to reference his own previous publications. Each concept flowed logically into the next, creating a coherent mathematical narrative that even non-specialists could follow. In the audience, Victor Reynolds sat with arms tightly crossed, his expression oscillating between skepticism and grudging attention as Eddie systematically addressed each of the criticisms Reynolds had raised the previous day. The elegant mathematics on display was not just sound, it was revolutionary, offering a perspective that bypassed theoretical roadblocks that had stymied the field for decades. The critical insight, Eddie explained, gesturing to a particularly dense equation on the screen, isn't that we need more complex mathematics to solve the paradox. It's that we need to embrace simpler, more elegant structures that better reflect the universe's fundamental nature. He smiled slightly. Sometimes we intellectualize problems so thoroughly that we miss the direct path staring us in the face. From his position at the side of the room, Thomas found himself nodding in agreement. Wasn't that precisely what had happened with Eddie himself? The institutional biases of academia had rendered a brilliant mind invisible because it didn't arrive in the expected package. The janitor had been pushing a mop for years while carrying in his head mathematics that might change humanity's understanding of the cosmos. When Eddie concluded his presentation, the silence in the room hung for a breathless moment before Professor Nakamura stood and began to applaud. Others joined quickly, the sound swelling until it filled the cavernous space. Eddie stood awkwardly under this wave of approval, his eyes finding his daughters in the front row. Sophia was crying openly, pride radiating from her like physical warmth. The question period that followed was intense but respectful. Senior faculty, who had initially viewed the situation with skepticism, now addressed Eddie as a colleague. NASA officials requested clarification on technical points relevant to propulsion applications. Even Dean Wallace, who had initially been concerned about the university's reputation, now seemed eager to associate Westbridge with this emerging breakthrough. Only Reynolds maintained his resistance, though his questions had shifted from outright dismissal to technical quibbling over specific mathematical transitions, the academic equivalent of a strategic retreat. After the formal session concluded, the audience broke into smaller discussion groups, with Eddie at the center of the largest cluster. Thomas watched from a distance, content to let the janitor-turned-theorist enjoy his well-deserved recognition. Eleanor Winters approached, coffee cup in hand. "Well, Thomas," she said quietly, "this is certainly not how I expected the week to unfold." "Life is occasionally kind enough to surprise us," he replied. "The Board of Trustees is already discussing options for a formal research position for Mr. Santos," Eleanor continued. "They're suddenly very keen to ensure he remains affiliated with Westbridge rather than being poached by MIT or Caltech." Thomas smiled slightly. Amazing how quickly institutional barriers dissolve when brilliance becomes undeniable. "Indeed," Eleanor sipped her coffee thoughtfully, "though I wonder if we would have recognized that brilliance without your advocacy. Most of us would have dismissed him without a second thought." "I nearly did exactly that," Thomas admitted. "We've built systems that value credentials over insight, pedigree over brilliance. How many other Eddie Santoses are out there, I wonder? Minds capable of extraordinary contributions, if only given the chance to be heard." Eleanor studied him with new interest. "This experience has changed you, Thomas. A week ago, you were the department's staunchest defender of academic orthodoxy." "Perhaps I needed to be reminded why I entered physics in the first place," Thomas replied. "Not to accumulate publications or preside over a hierarchy, but to understand the universe." Eddie approaches physics with a purity of purpose I had forgotten was possible. Their conversation was interrupted by James Harrington, who approached with barely contained excitement. "Mitchell, we need to discuss next steps. NASA wants to establish a formal research partnership immediately. Santos's framework has implications for our propulsion systems that could advance our timeline for the Europa mission by years, not to mention the applications for deep space exploration." "That's Eddie's decision to make," Thomas said firmly. "This is his work, his discovery." Harrington nodded. "Of course, but he values your input and will need institutional cooperation from Westbridge." He lowered his voice. "Between us, Headquarters is prepared to commit substantial funding to this research direction. We are talking 8 figures, possibly more as applications develop. Thomas raised an eyebrow. That would represent the largest research grant in the department's history. Which is why the paperwork needs to be impeccable, Harrington replied. Santos's unusual status creates complications. We need to establish his formal credentials and position. Those are bureaucratic details, Thomas said dismissively. The mathematics speaks for itself. In an ideal world, yes, Harrington agreed. But we live in this one, where forms must be completed, committees satisfied, and protocols followed. He glanced across the room at Eddie, still deep in conversation with a group of physicists. He's extraordinary, Thomas. But the system isn't designed for exceptions like him. After Harrington left, Thomas found himself contemplating the irony of the situation. Eddie Santos had developed mathematical insights that might revolutionize humanity's approach to space exploration. Yet, institutional structures still struggled to accommodate a brilliant mind that hadn't followed the prescribed path. The afternoon brought a series of meetings with university administration, NASA officials, and legal representatives, all working to establish a framework that would allow Eddie to lead the research his own discoveries had initiated. Though the discussions were largely congenial, Thomas couldn't help noticing the subtle ways in which Eddie was still treated differently from traditionally credentialed researchers. Questions were phrased carefully, assumptions about his knowledge base made explicit, his authority gently but persistently probed. Through it all, Eddie maintained the same quiet dignity he had shown while mopping floors and emptying trash bins. He answered questions directly, admitted when he needed to research a point further, and displayed neither insecurity about his background nor arrogance about his breakthrough. It was an impressive performance, though Thomas suspected it wasn't a performance at all, just Eddie being Eddie, treating his new role with the same conscientious attention he had given his old one. By evening, the initial framework for a research partnership had been established. Eddie would be appointed as a special research fellow at Westbridge, with a joint appointment at NASA's Glenn Research Center. The university would provide institutional support and research space, while NASA would fund the work and provide access to their computational resources and testing facilities. As the various officials filed out of the conference room, Thomas noticed Eddie sitting quietly at the end of the table, staring at the stack of documents before him with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. "Overwhelming day," Thomas observed, taking a seat beside him. Eddie looked up, his eyes tired but clear. "Yesterday I was concerned about getting written up for talking too long with faculty. Today I signed papers for a research grant larger than I can properly comprehend." Having second thoughts. "Not about the work," Eddie clarified. "I've believed in these ideas for years. It's the rest of it, the attention, the expectations, the politics. I watched how that Dr. Reynolds still looked at me during the presentation, like I'm an imposter who somehow slipped past security." Thomas nodded in understanding. Academia can be tribal. Some will never fully accept someone who hasn't paid the same dues they have, regardless of the brilliance of their work. "I don't need everyone's acceptance," Eddie said, "just the opportunity to develop these ideas properly." He smiled faintly. "Though I will miss certain aspects of janitorial work, there's a satisfaction in leaving a space cleaner than you found it, a concrete accomplishment at the end of each day." "Perhaps that's not so different from good theoretical physics," Thomas suggested. "We're attempting to leave our understanding of the universe cleaner, more ordered than we found it." Eddie laughed, a warm, genuine sound that transformed his tired face. "I like that perspective, Dr. Mitchell." "Thomas," he corrected, "I think we're well past formalities at this point." They walked together through the quiet evening campus, Students passed by, oblivious to the fact that the unassuming man in the borrowed blazer had just rewritten aspects of theoretical physics that had stumped their professors for decades. "Where will you go from here?" Thomas asked as they approached the parking lot. "Beyond the immediate research, I mean." Eddie considered the question seriously. "Sophia graduates next year. She wants to transfer to a 4-year program in engineering. Now I can help her with that without worrying about the cost." Pride colored his voice. "Beyond that, I'd like to find others like me. People with capacity for this work but without traditional paths to pursue it. There must be more of us out there." "You could develop an outreach program," Thomas suggested. "Identify unconventional talent. Create alternative pathways into theoretical sciences." "Would Westbridge support something like that?" Eddie asked skeptically. "It's a fairly radical departure from traditional academic gatekeeping." "The university just committed to a multi-million-dollar research partnership based on the work of a self-taught janitor," Thomas pointed out. "I'd say the precedent for unconventional approaches has been firmly established." They reached Eddie's car, a modest sedan with visible rust around the wheel wells. Eddie paused before opening the door. "I still haven't properly thanked you," he said, "for seeing potential in my work when you could have easily dismissed it." "I almost did dismiss it," Thomas admitted, "which would have been my loss, not yours. Your ideas would have been valid whether I recognized them or not, but they might never have been implemented," Eddie countered. "Ideas need champions, especially when they come from unexpected sources." He extended his hand. "So thank you, Thomas, for being willing to see beyond titles and credentials." Thomas shook the offered hand, feeling the calluses earned through years of physical labor, alongside the elegant mind that had unraveled cosmic mysteries. "The honor has been mine. Eddie, truly..." As Eddie drove away, Thomas remained in the parking lot, watching the taillights recede into the distance. The events of the past days had shaken foundations he had thought immovable. Assumptions about expertise, authority, and who had the right to contribute to humanity's greatest intellectual endeavors. For decades, Thomas Mitchell had been respected, even feared, as a guardian of academic standards. He had built his reputation on upholding the rigorous traditions of theoretical physics. Yet in less than a week, a janitor with a worn notebook had shown him that sometimes the most profound insights come from outside the carefully constructed towers of academia. The next morning brought fresh surprises. Thomas arrived at his office to find an envelope on his desk, hand-delivered rather than sent through university mail. Inside was a formal invitation to the White House, requesting his presence alongside Eddie Santos and the NASA team for a special recognition of their breakthrough work on the new propulsion framework. As Thomas stared at the presidential seal, on the letterhead, his office phone rang. The department secretary's voice came through, uncharacteristically excited. "Dr. Mitchell, CNN is holding on line 2. They want to schedule an interview about Mr. Santos and the NASA partnership. Oh, and Dr. Winters called. The president of the National Academy of Sciences is visiting campus next week, specifically to meet with Mr. Santos." Thomas thanked her and hung up, smiling to himself at the rapid transformation of Eddie's circumstances. Yesterday, a janitor. Today, a physicist in demand. The velocity of change was dizzying, yet somehow appropriate for a man whose work focused on the fundamental dynamics of the universe. He was still contemplating this when Eddie appeared in his doorway, wearing a new suit that actually fit his frame properly. "Sophia insisted," Eddie explained, noticing Thomas's appraising look. "Said I couldn't keep meeting NASA officials looking like I borrowed clothes from a larger cousin." His expression turned serious. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night about finding others like me." "And?" Thomas prompted. "I want to establish a foundation," Eddie said. using a portion of the research funding, something specifically designed to identify and support unconventional talents in theoretical sciences. People without traditional educational backgrounds, but with capacity for significant contributions. Thomas leaned forward, intrigued. What would you call it? The Alternative Pathways Initiative, Eddie suggested. A systematic approach to finding brilliant minds in unexpected places. Custodial staff, service workers, self-taught enthusiasts working in isolation, people the academic system traditionally overlooks. You'd need institutional partners, Thomas mused. Universities willing to provide resources and recognition outside traditional credential requirements. Which is why I'm starting with you, Eddie said. Will Westbridge support this? Thomas didn't hesitate. Westbridge will. I'll make certain of it. The conversation was interrupted by Eddie's phone chiming with an incoming message. He glanced at it and chuckled. Sophia says there's a crowd of reporters outside her community college trying to interview the daughter of the janitor who revolutionized physics. She's hiding in the library. Fame arrives quickly and leaves just as fast, Thomas observed, but your work, that will remain regardless of the media attention. Eddie nodded, his expression thoughtful. When I was mopping these floors, I used to listen to faculty discussions as I worked. So many brilliant minds talking about changing the world through knowledge. I never imagined I'd be part of that conversation. He smiled. Now I can't imagine not being part of it. The conversation is richer for your voice, Thomas said simply. Together they walked toward the lecture hall where a press conference had been hastily arranged. Reporters and cameras filled the room, all eager to capture the unlikely story of a janitor whose mathematical insights might transform humanity's approach to space exploration. Eddie paused before entering, visibly gathering himself for the barrage of attention ahead. Remember, Thomas said quietly, they're here for the story, but the work is what matters. Your equations don't care about your background or the media narrative. They're either true or they're not. Eddie straightened his shoulders. Truth is what got us here. It's what will carry us forward. As they stepped into the blinding camera, lights, Thomas reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. A week ago, he had been the celebrated professor and Eddie, the invisible support staff. Now they walked together as colleagues, united not by similar backgrounds or credentials, but by a shared commitment to understanding the universe's deepest truths. The media would craft this into a neat narrative. The janitor genius discovered by the distinguished professor, but the reality was more complex and more profound. Eddie Santos hadn't needed discovering. His brilliance had always been there, steadily developing insights while the academic world looked past him. What had needed discovering was the institutional blindness that had kept such talent relegated to the margins. As Eddie began speaking to the assembled press with the same clear, direct approach he had used in his technical presentation, Thomas saw reporters exchanging glances of surprise. They had expected an awkward, overwhelmed janitor thrust suddenly into the spotlight. Instead, they encountered a natural teacher explaining complex concepts with graceful simplicity. His confidence, stemming not from academic credentials, but from the deep understanding that comes from years of independent thought. In that moment, watching Eddie Santos address the world, not as a janitor, but as the physicist he had always been, Thomas Mitchell felt something shift in his understanding of his own life's work. He had spent decades pursuing knowledge within carefully constructed academic boundaries. Now he glimpsed a broader mission, expanding those boundaries to welcome brilliant minds regardless of their path. Eddie's voice carried clearly through the room. The universe doesn't ask for our credentials before revealing its secrets. It responds to curiosity, persistence, and the courage to question established thinking. Those qualities can be found anywhere, in prestigious laboratories, or in the quiet hours a janitor spends studying after his shift ends. Thomas smiled, recognizing the birth of a new chapter, not just for Eddie Santos or for theoretical physics, but for the very concept of who has the right to participate in humanity's greatest intellectual endeavors. Sometimes, the most profound discoveries happen not when we find new answers, but when we change the questions we're willing to ask. And sometimes, the most important formulas aren't just those that explain the cosmos, but those that expand our understanding of human potential itself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.